cold linoleum pressed against my cheek when my heart gave out, reeking of cheap bleach and 50 years of broken promises. Waking up a decade earlier didn't feel like a divine miracle. It just felt like a sick, recycled joke. David stood before me, impatiently holding the velvet box containing the 5-carat diamond that had catalyzed my previous ruin, waiting for my predictable tears of gratitude. Instead, I smiled, plucked the ring from his fingers, and slid that cursed rock onto his mother's greedy hand. Let his obsessive first love tear her apart this time. Death is not a peaceful fade to black. It is a violent tearing, a suffocation that tastes like pennies and smells like ozone. So, when my lungs suddenly expanded, drawing in a sharp, jagged breath of air conditioned to a crisp 68 degrees, my first instinct wasn't to marvel at my resurrection. It was to throw up. I gripped the edge of the kitchen island. The marble was freezing under my palms. Real marble, not the chipped formica of the studio apartment I had died in. I squeezed my eyes shut, listening to the low, mechanical hum of the refrigerator. Well, are you going to say something, or just stare at it like an idiot? David's voice, 10 years younger, absent the slight rasp he'd developed from chain-smoking cigars, but dripping with the same condescending impatience I had spent a lifetime making excuses for. I opened my eyes. He stood in the center of our open-concept kitchen, dressed in his tailored navy suit, holding a small, midnight blue velvet box. My eyes drifted past him to the living room, where his mother, Brenda, lounged on my cream-colored sofa. She was aggressively filing her acrylic nails, the rough sh-sh-sh sound scraping against my raw nerves. Brenda smelled of cloying jasmine perfume and stale Virginia Slims, a scent that immediately coated the back of my throat. The ring. Memory hit me like a physical blow, heavy and precise. It was our 5th anniversary. In my first life, David presented me with this ridiculous, ostentatious 5-carat diamond. I had cried. I had thought it meant he finally loved me, that he was finally committing to our marriage after years of cold detachment. But Brenda had immediately thrown a tantrum. She claimed I was too careless to wear something so expensive, that a son should honor his mother first. We fought. David sided with her, taking the ring back to keep the peace. What I didn't know then was that David had actually bought the ring for Jessica, his volatile first love, who had just moved back to the city. Using me and his mother as a smokescreen was his way of hiding the purchase from our joint bank accounts. When Jessica found out I had laid claim to it, she made it her mission to destroy me. She succeeded. I stared at the velvet box. The fabric looked soft, but I knew the hinge inside was stiff. Clara, David sighed, shifting his weight. His leather shoes squeaked slightly on the hardwood. I don't have all morning. I have a board meeting at 10. I didn't cry this time. My tear ducts felt entirely dry, filled with nothing but dust and exhaustion. I walked over to him. My legs felt heavy, as if moving underwater, but I kept my face blank. "It's beautiful," I said. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, flat, devoid of the desperate, eager-to-please pitch I used to carry. I took the box from his hands. The diamond caught the overhead recessed lighting, throwing fractured rainbows across David's crisp white collar. It was a gaudy thing. Tacky, really. Just a jagged piece of compressed carbon designed to buy silence. From the sofa, Brenda scoffed. She dropped her nail file onto the glass coffee table with a sharp clack. "It's too big for her hands," she announced, marching over. Brenda was 58, but dressed like she was 22. Since David's company had taken off, she'd invested heavily in Botox, fillers, and a wardrobe consisting entirely of tight designer athleisure and heavy gold hardware. Today, it was a hot pink velour tracksuit. She'll just snag it on the laundry. Honestly, David, a waste of money for a housewife. In the past, I would have clutched the box to my chest. I would have argued, my voice trembling, defending my worthiness as a wife. Today, I looked at Brenda. I noticed the slight unevenness of her lip filler, the desperate way her eyes clung to the wealth her son represented. "You know what, Brenda?" I said, my tone eerily calm. "You're absolutely right." David blinked, his brow furrowing. "What?" I stepped toward my mother-in-law. I plucked the heavy platinum band from the velvet slit. The metal was cold. Without breaking eye contact with her, I reached out, took her left hand, and shoved the ring onto her middle finger. It stuck for a second at the knuckle, then slid down. Brenda gasped, a sharp intake of air that smelled of mints and plaque. She stared at her hand, completely paralyzed by the sudden shift in gravity. "It suits you much better," I said, offering a tight, closed-mouth smile. "David, your mother does so much for us. She raised you. She deserves to wear the 5 carats, don't you think? It looks far too cheap for my taste, anyway." The silence in the kitchen was absolute. The refrigerator hummed louder. David stared at me, his jaw slightly slack, trying to compute the variables. He couldn't object without insulting his mother, and he couldn't take it back without causing a scene. He was trapped by his own cowardice. Well, David stammered, running a hand through his gelled hair. The gel made a faint, sticky sound. "If Clara doesn't want it." "Oh, my baby boy," Brenda shrieked, instantly recovering. She threw her arms around David, nearly knocking him off balance. "I knew you were a good son, not like some ungrateful people." She shot me a venomous look over his shoulder, but it lacked its usual sting. She was too distracted by the weight on her finger. I turned away, walking to the sink to run the cold water. I splashed my face. The water was biting, shocking my system into the present reality. I was really here. I was alive, and I was completely, fundamentally done. 4 days passed. The atmosphere in the house shifted into a strange, tense purgatory. David was jumpy. Every time his phone buzzed, his shoulders seized. He was spending longer hours at the office, coming home smelling faintly of expensive gin and a different, sweeter perfume. Jessica, she had him on a tight leash, and I knew she was demanding to see the ring he had promised her. The ring that was currently permanently attached to Brenda's hand. Brenda, meanwhile, was insufferable. She strutted around our home like a lottery winner. She took hundreds of photos of her hand resting on steering wheels, holding wine glasses, and draped over designer handbags. She posted them all to her public Instagram. Her captions were nauseatingly vague. "Spoiled by my main man." Hashtag blessed hashtag diamonds. Hashtag he loves me. To a stranger, her feed didn't look like a proud mother. With her face entirely filtered, her body squeezed into tight dresses, and her captions heavily implying romantic devotion, she looked exactly like a sugar baby. I sat at the kitchen counter on a Thursday afternoon, peeling an orange, the rind split beneath my thumbnail, releasing a sharp, bright burst of citrus into the air. I watched Brenda out on the patio, yelling at the landscaper while waving her left hand aggressively so the sunlight caught the diamond. It was time to light the match. In my past life, Jessica had found out about the ring through David's credit card statements. This time, I needed her to find Brenda. I wiped my sticky fingers on a paper towel and pulled out the cheap prepaid phone I had bought at a gas station 2 days prior. The plastic casing felt flimsy and light. I had spent hours scrolling through David's iPad while he slept, finding Jessica's current contact info. She wasn't hard to find. Her digital footprint was a monument to narcissism. I opened a blank text message. I didn't want to sound like a concerned friend. I needed to sound like a careless acquaintance gossiping. I attached a screenshot I'd taken from Brenda's Instagram. It was a picture of Brenda from behind, wearing a tight black cocktail dress, her hand resting on David's shoulder, at a restaurant they'd gone to last night. The diamond ring was front and center. I had cropped the photo just enough so David's face was visible, but Brenda's was hidden. She just looked like a slender, blonde woman wearing Jessica's promised ring. I typed out a message with deliberate grammatical flaws. Saw Dave at Le Petit Maison last night. Thought he was broke. He just dropped like 100,000 on a ring for this chick. Thought you guys were back together? Guess he moved on fast, LOL. I hit send. I set the phone down on the counter. The plastic made a hollow tapping sound. I picked up a segment of the orange, placed it on my tongue, and let the tart juice flood my mouth. I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline. I didn't feel like a mastermind. I just felt a deep, profound exhaustion, mixed with a cold curiosity. Jessica was not a rational woman. She was deeply insecure, violently possessive, and notoriously impulsive. 10 years ago, she had thrown a glass ashtray at my head and lacerated my scalp when she thought I was the one keeping David from her. Now, she was going to think David was spending her money, her ring, on some flashy blonde bimbo. 3 minutes later, the burner phone vibrated. A single message from Jessica. "Who is this? Who is that bitch?" I didn't reply. I simply sent another screenshot. This one was Brenda's location tag from her morning post. A high-end hair salon in the downtown district. Gilded shears. Brenda had a 3-hour appointment for cut, color, and extensions today at 1 p.m. I checked the clock on the microwave. 1:15 p.m. I stood up, threw the orange peels into the garbage disposal, and flipped the switch. The loud, grinding roar of the blades, chewing through the rinds, filled the kitchen, drowning out the silence. I grabbed my coat. I had a coffee date to attend. The afternoon air was heavy, with the smell of impending rain. That sharp, dusty scent of ozone and dry concrete. I walked 2 blocks from where I parked my car, pulling my trench coat tighter around my waist. The wind was picking up, whipping stray leaves against my ankles. Gilded Shears was located on a corner lot, featuring massive floor-to-ceiling windows. It was an exhibitionist's salon. People didn't go there just to get their hair done. They went there to be seen getting their hair done. Directly across the street was a small, independent cafe with scratched wooden tables and a constantly hissing espresso machine. I walked in, ordered an iced latte, and took a seat at the window counter on a wobbly metal stool. The glass of the window was cold against my forehead. I took a sip of the latte. The espresso was bitter, burnt, masked poorly by too much cheap oat milk. Condensation formed on the plastic cup, leaving a wet ring on the distressed wood counter. I watched the salon. Inside, through the pristine glass, I could see Brenda. She was seated in a prime center chair, draped in a black salon cape. Her head was currently wrapped in foils, pointing directly up as she animatedly talked to her stylist, gesturing wildly with her left hand. Even from across the street, the overhead halogens caught the massive diamond. I waited. The cafe was mostly empty, save for a barista wiping down the steam wand and an old man reading a newspaper. the rustle of the pages loud in the quiet room. At 1:42 p.m., a black Uber pulled up violently to the curb outside the salon, its tires scraping against the concrete. The back door flew open. Jessica stepped out. I felt a strange, detached tightening in my chest. There she was, the woman who had orchestrated my social and financial ruin. She was thinner than I remembered, dressed in sharp, aggressive fashion. A tailored crimson blazer, black skinny jeans, and stiletto boots that clicked against the pavement like gunshots. Her dark hair was slicked back. Her face, a mask of concentrated, murderous fury. She didn't even close the car door. She marched directly toward the heavy glass doors of gilded shears and yanked them open. I leaned forward on my wobbly stool, gripping the plastic coffee cup until the sides buckled slightly. Through the massive windows, the pantomime played out with beautiful, chaotic clarity. Jessica stormed into the center of the salon. The receptionist, a young guy in a fitted turtleneck, stood up to intercept her, but Jessica shoved past him without breaking stride. She honed in on the center chair. She honed in on the black cape, the blonde foils, and the diamond ring. Brenda, completely oblivious, was laughing at something her stylist said. Jessica reached the chair. She didn't announce herself. She didn't demand an explanation. Her possessive rage, fueled by days of David avoiding her and the fresh proof of his infidelity on my burner texts, completely bypassed logic. Jessica grabbed Brenda by the shoulders of the salon cape and spun the chair around. Brenda's mouth dropped open in shock, her heavily lined eyes wide. Before Brenda could even form a syllable, Jessica swung. Smack, even across the street over the traffic. I couldn't hear it, but I could feel it. The impact of Jessica's open palm against Brenda's newly Botoxed cheek was violent enough to snap Brenda's head to the side. The cafe barista dropped a metal pitcher. It clanged loudly against the floor. In the salon, utter pandemonium erupted. Brenda, recovering from the initial shock, let out a scream that contorted her face. She wasn't a fragile woman. She was a street fighter, masked in designer labels. Brenda lunged forward, her acrylic nails aiming directly for Jessica's eyes. Jessica grabbed a handful of Brenda's hair, foils, bleach, and all, and yanked downward. Brenda shrieked, her hands flailing, managing to hook 2 fingers into the collar of Jessica's crimson blazer and tearing it down the lapel. Stylists were scattering. Clients in processing capes were leaping out of their chairs, knocking over trays of dye. A bowl of magenta color hit the floor, splattering like a gruesome crime scene across the pristine white tiles. My ring! Take it off, you cheap whore! I could read Jessica's lips, her face twisted in an ugly, feral snarl as she tried to wrestle Brenda's left hand. Help! She's crazy! Get her off me! Brenda was shrieking, kicking her legs blindly under the cape, her heavy orthopedic sneakers connecting with Jessica's shins. They went down, a tangle of limbs, tearing foil, and screaming women crashing onto the floor amidst the spilled hair dye. I took another sip of my terrible latte. The ice clinked softly against the plastic. My heart rate hadn't spiked. My hands weren't shaking. I watched them tear each other apart with the mild interest of someone watching a predictable nature documentary. The receptionist was furiously dialing his phone, undoubtedly calling the police. I set my cup down. The moisture from the condensation felt cool against my fingers. I pulled out my actual phone, scrolling to David's contact. I waited until I saw the flashing red and blue lights of a squad car turning the corner 2 blocks down. I hit call. It rang twice before he picked up. Clara, I'm in a meeting. I can't. David, I interrupted, injecting a perfect, trembling note of panic into my voice. "David, you need to come to Gilded Shears downtown right now. It's your mother." "What? What happened?" The annoyance in his voice vanished, replaced by genuine alarm. "I was walking by to meet a friend. David, a woman just attacked her. A younger woman in a red blazer. She's screaming about a diamond ring. The police are pulling up right now. You need to get here." Silence on the line. I could practically hear the gears in David's head, grinding, locking, and bursting into flames as he realized that the two women he had been lying to were currently rolling around on a salon floor in front of law enforcement. "I'm on my way," he choked out, hanging up. I lowered the phone. Across the street, two police officers were struggling to pull a wildly thrashing Jessica off a sobbing, disheveled Brenda. One of Brenda's foils was plastered to the window glass, smudged with purple toner. I smiled. It was a small, tired thing, but it was genuine. Fluorescent lights in the 12th precinct buzzed with a relentless, erratic frequency that gave me a low-grade migraine. The air inside the waiting room tasted like stale sweat, burnt drip coffee, and cheap floor wax. I sat on a hard oak bench, the wood grain pressing uncomfortably into my thighs through my denim jeans. Every time the heavy reinforced double doors leading to the holding cells swung open, a wall of ammonia and damp concrete rolled out, coating the back of my throat. I checked my phone. It had been 42 minutes since I called David. He burst through the precinct entrance, looking like a man who had just survived a multi-car pileup. His perfectly styled hair, usually glued into submission with imported pomade, had split down the middle. A damp lock plastered itself against his forehead. Sweat stained the armpits of his tailored blue shirt, spreading in dark crescents against the expensive cotton. His leather briefcase slapped heavily against his thigh as he rushed the front desk, his expensive Oxfords squeaking violently on the scuffed linoleum. "My mother," he gasped to the bored desk sergeant, a heavy-set man slowly chewing a wad of pink gum while staring at a muted television screen. "Brenda. She was brought in. Assault." I stood up, letting the heavy oak bench creak loudly beneath me. "David." He spun around, his chest heaving. Relief, desperate and deeply pathetic, washed over his features when he saw me. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, grabbing my shoulders. His palms were clammy, leaving cold, damp spots through the fabric of my trench coat. "Clara, thank God. Are you okay? What happened?" "The police wouldn't tell me anything on the phone. Who attacked her?" "I don't know her name," I lied. My voice flat, devoid of the familiar anxious tremor he was so used to hearing. "A younger brunette, red blazer. She came screaming into the salon about a ring." "David, it was horrific. They tore half your mother's hair out. The police had to drag them apart on the floor." The color drained from David's face, leaving his complexion the shade of dirty dishwater. He dropped his hands from my shoulders as if my jacket had suddenly caught fire. "A brunette, red blazer. She kept screaming about how your mother stole her diamond, the one you supposedly gave her." I tilted my head, studying the microscopic, terrified twitch pulling at the corner of his left eye. "Do you know her?" Before he could scramble his brain for a plausible lie, the heavy double doors swung open. An officer walked out, holding a metal clipboard. Behind him, visible through the reinforced safety glass, was the temporary holding pen. And there they were. Brenda sat on a metal bench, her hot pink velour tracksuit smeared with a disgusting concoction of magenta hair dye, spilled bleach, and dirty floor water. Half her head was still trapped in crushed aluminum foils, the developer oxidizing into a brittle, brassy orange. She was weeping, Her face, a bloated, puffy mess of ruined foundation, smeared mascara, and fresh, red scratches down her neck. On the opposite metal bench sat Jessica. Her crimson blazer was torn at the shoulder seam, exposing a jagged rip in her black silk camisole. One of her stiletto boots was completely missing. She paced the confined space like a rabid feral cat, her chest heaving, glaring at Brenda with a hatred so pure and unadulterated it practically radiated through the reinforced glass. David made a sound in the back of his throat, a choked, strangled whimper. It was the sound of a man watching two separate, carefully constructed, heavily funded timelines violently collapse into each other. "David," Brenda shrieked the moment she spotted him through the glass. Her voice scraped against the concrete walls, muffled but ear-piercing. "Get me out of here! This absolute lunatic attacked me. She tried to steal the anniversary ring you bought me." Jessica stopped pacing. Her head snapped toward the glass, her dark, heavily lined eyes locking directly onto David. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just pressed her bare hands flat against the window. "You bought her a ring." Jessica's voice was lower, deadlier. "You told me the diamond was for me, Dave. You told me you were finally leaving your pathetic, broke-down wife, and you gave my ring to this old, cheap trash. Who are you calling cheap?" Brenda exploded, launching herself off the metal bench so fast she nearly tripped over her own orthopedic sneakers. "I am his mother, you psychotic tramp." "Mother?" Jessica froze, the absolute bewilderment finally breaking through her tunnel vision rage. She looked from Brenda to David, and then, very slowly, her eyes slid over to me, standing calmly beside him. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The older woman wasn't the new mistress. She was the mother-in-law, and I was the wife, standing right there, listening to all of it. The officer with the clipboard cleared his throat loudly, uncapping a cheap ballpoint pen. "Sir, you here to post bail for Brenda or Jessica?" David stood entirely paralyzed. The hum of the fluorescent lights suddenly felt deafening in the quiet precinct waiting room. He was trapped. It was a beautiful, inescapable checkmate. If he bailed out Jessica, his mother would publicly disown him and make his life a living hell. If he bailed out his mother, Jessica would immediately expose his long-term affair to everyone, ruin his professional reputation, and likely vandalize his car in the parking lot. I didn't give him time to solve the puzzle. I reached into my oversized leather tote bag. The smooth manila envelope felt satisfyingly thick between my fingers. I pulled it out and tapped it gently against David's chest. He flinched violently, looking down at the envelope like it was a live grenade. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice cracking on the last syllable. "The way out," I said quietly. My tone wasn't malicious or victorious. It was just numb. The sound of a machine powering down for the very last time. "I'm done, David. Both of them are your problem now. Sign these by Friday, or my lawyer starts digging into the Cayman accounts you thought I didn't know about." I didn't wait for him to open it. I turned on my heel. The precinct doors pushed open with a heavy metallic clatter, and the cool, damp city air hit my face. Behind me, the muffled, hysterical shrieks of his mother and his mistress started up again, a chaotic symphony of his own making. I walked to my car, the gravel crunching under my boots. I unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and breathed in the smell of old leather and cold air conditioning. For the first time in 10 years, I breathed without feeling a crushing weight on my ribs. Cardboard boxes always smell like dust and anticipation. I stood in the center of our massive master bedroom, a sharp metal box cutter in my hand, slicing through a fresh roll of packing tape. The loud rip echoed off the high ceilings, sharp and final. The house was suffocatingly quiet compared to the three-ring circus at the precinct. It was a genuinely beautiful house. Truthfully, a sprawling mid-century modern build tucked away in the expensive hills, filled with authentic teak furniture and curated abstract art that David's corporate assistant had picked out. In my first life, I had spent hours polishing the baseboards, arranging throw pillows, and trying desperately to make it feel like a home. I had tied my entire identity to keeping this pristine, soulless museum clean for a man who barely looked at me. Now, looking at the expensive gray silk sheets on our king-sized bed, I just felt a profound, heavy emptiness. Not a loss, just a bitter acknowledgement of wasted time. I wasn't taking much. Just my clothes, my old paperback books, and the few pieces of simple jewelry I had bought with my own money before quitting my graphic design job to support his startup vision. The rest of it, the stainless steel espresso machine that required an engineering degree to operate, the itchy cashmere throws Brenda had aggressively gifted us every Christmas, the monstrous flat-screen television he could keep. They were just heavy anchors. I was folding a stack of faded band t-shirts, the worn cotton soft beneath my fingertips, when the heavy oak front door slammed downstairs. Heavy, erratic footsteps pounded up the hardwood stairs. David appeared in the bedroom doorway, gripping the frame. He looked significantly worse than he had at the police station. His tie was gone, his collar violently unbuttoned, and a faint smear of what looked like dry blood, probably from breaking up another physical altercation between the two women, streaked across his jawline. The smell of stale sweat, expensive gin, and cheap precinct coffee rolled off him in waves, filling the bedroom. He stared at the cardboard boxes stacked against the wall. His jaw worked silently for a long moment before he finally managed to speak. "You're actually doing this. You're just packing up and walking away." I didn't look up. I placed a t-shirt into the box, smoothing down the edges with deliberate care. "I already walked away, David. I'm just taking my things now. Over a misunderstanding." He stepped into the room, his leather shoes scuffing the vintage Persian rug. The sheer audacity in his voice was staggering. It wasn't an apology. It was an accusation. He sounded like a man who believed he was the victim of a terrible injustice. "You set this whole thing up, didn't you? You sent Jessica after my mother. You knew exactly what you were doing when you put that ring on Mom's finger." I stopped folding. I rested my hands on the edge of the cardboard box. The corrugated edge bit slightly into my palms, grounding me. I looked at him. Really looked at him. Without the heavy, distorting lens of desperate love or the ingrained fear of abandonment, he was just a man, a tired, average, deeply selfish man who was used to manipulating his way out of every consequence he ever faced. "You bought a 5-carat diamond for your mistress with money from our joint savings account, David," I said, my voice eerily steady. "You lied to me. You lied to your mother. You lied to her. I didn't make Jessica violently unstable, and I didn't make your mother a greedy narcissist. I just introduced them to each other. Gravity did the rest. I was going to end it with her," he yelled, throwing his hands up in a theatrical display of frustration. "Jessica is crazy, Clara. I was trying to find a way out. I bought the ring to pacify her, so she wouldn't come to the house and cause a massive scene. I was protecting you, The lie was so incredibly clumsy, so profoundly insulting to my intelligence, that a short, bitter laugh punched its way out of my throat before I could stop it. Protecting me. Right. By telling her you were leaving me. By letting her think I was the evil, clinging villain keeping you apart. Tell me, David, in your past, when she destroyed my reputation, when she harassed my friends, when you stood by and let her push me to the absolute brink, was that you protecting me, too? He blinked, deeply confused. My past? What the hell are you talking about? Are you having a psychotic break? I closed my eyes for a second, rubbing the bridge of my nose. The dull migraine from the precinct was creeping back into the base of my skull. Explaining the reality of my rebirth was pointless. He wouldn't believe it, and I didn't care enough to try. Never mind. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you read the papers in the envelope. I'm not signing anything. He crossed his arms, leaning heavily against the doorframe, trying to project a commanding authority he no longer held. You're my wife. We built the company together. You don't get to just throw a sudden tantrum, pack a box, and try to take half of my assets. I don't want half, I said, picking up the heavy tape dispenser. I want what I'm legally and morally owed. And if you want to fight it in court, we can absolutely talk to a judge about the shell corporation in Delaware you've been using to funnel untaxed revenue since 2022. I wonder how the IRS would feel about those accounting tricks. David's face went entirely slack. The remaining color drained from his lips, leaving them a pale, sickly gray. His arms dropped heavily to his sides. How? How do I know? I pulled a long strip of tape across the top of the box. The loud, screaming squirt sound of the adhesive made him flinch violently. You're a terrible password manager, David. Using Jessica 2024 for your encrypted financial folders is insulting on multiple levels. I picked up the box. It was heavy, packed tight with hardback books, but I managed to hoist it against my hip. I walked toward him. He didn't move until I was mere inches away. He smelled heavily, like fear now. A sour, metallic, primitive scent that completely overpowered his expensive Tom Ford cologne. Move, I said quietly. He stepped aside. I walked past him, down the long hallway, and out of the house. I didn't look back at the grand staircase or the expensive art. There was nothing left in that house worth looking at. The law offices of Richard Davies and Associates smelled distinctly of old money, lemon polish, and aggressive air conditioning. The burgundy leather guest chair squeaked loudly beneath me as I shifted my weight, carefully balancing a delicate porcelain cup of black coffee on my knee. The coffee was extremely bitter, scalding hot, and exactly what I needed to clear the residual emotional fog of the last 3 days. Richard Davies sat across his massive, imposing oak desk, sliding his reading glasses down the bridge of his sharp, hawk-like nose. He was a ruthless man, built like a retired heavyweight boxer who had traded his gloves for a custom 3-piece suit. I had chosen him specifically because he possessed a terrifying reputation for dissecting hostile, high-net-worth divorces with the cold, unfeeling precision of a medical autopsy. You've certainly done your homework, Clara, Richard murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the heavy desk. He flipped through the thick, 3-ring binder of printed screenshots, bank statements, and tax returns I had dropped in front of him 20 minutes prior. These monthly transfers to the Delaware LLC, they're incredibly sloppy. He's commingling corporate funds with his personal accounts to artificially lower his net worth and hide assets from marital property. And these large wire transfers to a J. Miller? Jessica Miller, I clarified, taking a slow sip of the hot coffee. The heat burned the roof of my mouth slightly, keeping me sharply grounded in the present. His mistress. He's been paying the rent for her luxury loft downtown and funneling cash directly to her under the guise of independent consulting fees for his tech company. Richard let out a short, sharp bark of laughter. Consulting fees, a classic move, and incredibly, legally stupid. He closed the thick binder with a heavy thud. The sound was deeply, profoundly satisfying. So, what's the actual play here? We can take this directly to family court, drag him completely through the mud, and you'll easily walk away with 70% of the liquid assets plus permanent alimony. I set the delicate teacup down on his desk. The porcelain clinked sharply against the polished wood. I don't want a long, drawn-out court battle, Richard. I don't want to spend the next 2 years looking at his face in deposition rooms. I want a surgical, immediate strike. I want to bleed him dry before he even realizes he's been cut. Richard raised a thick eyebrow, leaning back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. I'm listening. David's tech startup is currently in the middle of a massive Series B funding round, I explained, leaning forward. The adrenaline was finally kicking in, a cold, sharp, metallic focus that made my vision razor clear. He desperately needs to show perfectly clean books and steady cash flow to his venture capital investors by the end of this month. If there's even a slight hint of financial instability or worse, corporate fraud, the investors will pull out immediately. The company will tank overnight. You want to completely nuke his company. No, I corrected, my tone hardening. I technically own 30% of that company. I helped build the initial software in our garage while he was out networking at expensive steakhouses. I want his shares. I want to force a hostile buyout. I pulled a second, thinner folder from my tote bag and slid it across the polished desk. I want you to file an emergency ex parte motion to freeze all joint accounts immediately, citing the active dissipation of marital assets. Use the wire transfers to Jessica and the fraudulent Delaware LLC as concrete proof he's hiding money. Once those accounts are legally frozen, his company's entire payroll will bounce next Tuesday. Richard traced his strong jawline with his thumb, his dark eyes gleaming with a professional, predatory interest. If his payroll bounces during a critical funding round, he's absolutely dead in the water. The employees will panic, and the investors will run. He'll be desperate for immediate capital. Exactly. A cold smile touched my lips, feeling entirely foreign, but perfectly correct. When he's panicking, when the accounts are locked and the investors are actively threatening to pull out, you hit him with the final settlement offer. I'll unfreeze the accounts and keep the IRS completely out of the Delaware mess. But he signs over all of his voting shares in the company, to me, plus the deed to the house. He walks away with his empty CEO title and whatever loose cash he has stuffed under his mattress. Richard chuckled, a low, dangerous sound that filled the office. It's extortion adjacent. I absolutely love it. But you realize this will utterly destroy him. He'll lose total control of his own company. He lost control the minute he bought that ring, I said softly. The phantom memory of the cold linoleum floor in my past life, flashing violently behind my eyes, the sharp smell of cheap bleach, the crushing, suffocating weight of a failing heart. I'm just handing him the receipt. By Friday morning, The trap finally snapped shut. I was sitting on the small concrete balcony of my newly rented apartment, wrapped in a thick, oversized wool sweater against the biting morning chill. The air smelled of damp earth, impending rain, and car exhaust from the busy street far below. A heavy ceramic mug of green tea warmed my palms. My phone, resting face up on the wrought iron table, began to violently vibrate. The bright screen flashed David's name. I let it ring. The metallic buzzing sound vibrated harshly against the table, a frantic, desperate rhythm. It stopped, then immediately started ringing again. I picked it up on the fourth ring, bringing the cold glass to my ear. "Hello, Clara." His voice was a panicked, high-pitched shriek, completely devoid of his usual polished, arrogant cadence. Background noise echoed loudly behind him, the chaotic, overlapping sound of an office in total turmoil. "What the hell did you do? My corporate cards are declining. The main accounts are locked. The bank says there's a massive legal hold." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. The steam curled gently against my cheeks. "I'm protecting my assets, David. You have a very bad habit of giving them away to angry women in hair salons. You insane bitch. You can't do this," he screamed, the sharp sound of something heavy, probably a coffee mug, smashing against a wall, echoed through the speaker. "Payroll goes out on Tuesday. If we bounce payroll, the Series B investors will launch a full audit. They'll walk. You're going to completely ruin everything we built." "Correction," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm, deadpan whisper. "I am going to save what I built. You are going to sign the settlement papers my lawyer sent you an hour ago. Check your inbox, David." "Papers? What papers?" I could hear the frantic, rapid clicking of a computer mouse, his heavy, ragged breathing scraping against the phone's microphone. Then, a long, incredibly hollow silence. "You," his voice cracked, instantly reduced to a dry, broken rasp. "You want my voting shares? You want total control of the board? Clara, this is my company. I am the CEO. And you're doing a genuinely terrible job. A CEO shouldn't commingle corporate funds with a shell company to pay his mistress's rent. It's terrible for employee morale." I leaned back in my chair, looking up at the heavy, gray, overcast sky. "Sign the settlement, David. Sign over the shares. Give me the house, and I'll call Richard to lift the financial freeze. You get to keep your fancy title and your salary, but I make all the decisions from now on. If you don't sign by 5 o'clock today, I let the investors see the Delaware tax returns." "You wouldn't," he whispered, but the arrogant defiance was completely gone. It was just fear now. Raw, unadulterated, suffocating terror. "Try me." I hung up the phone. I didn't turn it off. I just set it back on the cold iron table and listened to the distant, rhythmic hum of city traffic. The air felt significantly lighter. My chest, which had been painfully tight for 10 years, finally expanded completely. The real revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't a screaming match in a public hair salon, and it wasn't a tearful breakdown in a police station. It was quiet. It was the simple click of a pen in the freezing of a bank account. It was the cold, undeniable realization that the woman he thought was acceptable collateral damage was actually the architect of his total ruin. I closed my eyes, letting the cool wind brush against my face, and waited patiently for the email notification that would finalize his absolute surrender. The DocuSign email arrived at exactly 4:58 p.m. on Friday. The notification sound on my laptop was a crisp, cheerful little chime that felt aggressively out of place in the heavy, overcast afternoon. I didn't cheer. I didn't pop champagne. I simply clicked the PDF attachment and scrolled down to the final page. There it was, David's digital signature, cramped and jagged, a visual representation of a man who had been backed into a corner with a gun to his head. He had surrendered his voting shares. He had surrendered the deed to the house. He was now, for all intents and purposes, an employee of the company we built, serving entirely at my discretion. I closed the laptop. The metal casing was cool beneath my palms. Monday morning tasted like peppermint toothpaste and black coffee. I wore a tailored charcoal blazer that I had bought at a thrift store 3 years ago, paired with sharp, aggressively pointed black flats. No jewelry, no makeup, save for a layer of matte lip balm. I wasn't dressing to impress anyone. I was dressing like a landlord, coming to collect rent. The corporate headquarters of Apex Dynamics occupied the entire 14th floor of a glass and steel monolith downtown. When the elevator doors slid open, the smell of fresh carpet off-gassing and expensive, overly sweet air freshener hit me instantly. The receptionist, a young woman named Sarah, who had only ever seen me at the annual holiday party, clutching a warm glass of cheap Pinot Grigio, blinked in surprise. "Clara, hi, David didn't mention you were coming in today." "He didn't know," I said, my voice level. "Is he in the main conference room?" Yes, but he's in the middle of the Series B pitch with the venture capital team from Vanguard. You can't go in there right now." "Watch me," I replied, walking past her desk. My flats made absolutely no sound on the thick corporate carpet. It felt like I was gliding, detached from the physical laws of the building. The main conference room had floor-to-ceiling glass walls, though the electronic privacy frost had been activated, turning the glass into a glowing, opaque sheet of white. I didn't knock. I grabbed the heavy brushed steel handle and pushed the door open. The room was freezing. The air conditioning was cranked so high I could feel the hairs on my arms stand up. The smell of catered turkey sandwiches, dry erase markers, and stale corporate anxiety was suffocating. 8 men in various shades of navy and gray suits turned to look at me. At the head of the long mahogany table stood David. He held a laser pointer, the red dot hovering nervously over a line graph projected onto a massive screen. His face, already shiny with a thin layer of nervous sweat, went entirely bloodless the moment he saw me. He looked like he was going to vomit right onto the polished wood. "Clara," David choked out. His voice was too high, scraping against the absolute silence of the room. "We are in the middle of a private presentation." One of the VC partners, an older man with silver hair and a deeply lined face, frowned. "Who is this, David? We asked for no interruptions." I didn't wait for David to fumble through an excuse. I walked to the head of the table. I didn't look at my husband. I looked directly at the silver-haired partner. "My name is Clara," I said, my voice calm, projecting effortlessly over the hum of the overhead projector. "I am the majority shareholder of Apex Dynamics. I hold 65% of the voting stock, and effective as a Friday evening, I am the chair of the board. I apologize for the interruption, gentlemen, but I felt it was necessary to be present for the financial disclosures of this funding round." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crack the table. The silver-haired partner shifted his gaze from me to David. "David, what is she talking about? You told us you retained full equity control." David's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The red dot from his laser pointer dropped to the floor, vibrating erratically near my shoes. He was physically trembling. He looked small, stripped of his arrogance, stripped of his stolen money. He was just a terrified, inadequate man, drowning in a suit he couldn't fill. There was a recent restructuring, David finally managed to croak out, wiping the back of his hand across his sweaty forehead. The gesture was deeply unprofessional. It reeked of panic. A necessary one, I interjected smoothly, pulling out the empty leather chair directly to David's right and sitting down. The leather sighed loudly beneath me. To ensure the long-term stability of the company, we've recently identified and eliminated several unnecessary financial leaks, commingled funds, and questionable consultant payouts. We are now running a completely transparent ship. I looked at David. His eyes were wide, begging me silently not to expose the Delaware LLC and the Mistress right in front of the men holding a $30 million check. I let him sweat for 5 agonizing seconds. I watched the terror pulse in the vein at his temple. David has been instrumental in the product design, I continued, offering the investors a tight, polite smile. But moving forward, I will be approving all capital allocations. Please, David, continue with the slide on Q3 projections. I'm very eager to hear your thoughts. I leaned back in the chair and crossed my legs. David stood there, his entire reality fractured. He had to stand in front of the most important men in his industry and publicly dance on the strings I was pulling. If he argued, I blew up the company. If he submitted, he admitted to the entire room that he was completely emasculated, a puppet in his own empire. He swallowed hard. The sound was audible, slowly, humiliatingly. He turned back to the screen. As you can see on the graph, he stammered, his voice lacking any of its former booming confidence. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel a rush of victorious adrenaline. Watching him break was like watching a cheap plastic toy snap under pressure. It was inevitable, slightly pathetic, and deeply necessary. I picked up a complimentary bottle of water from the center of the table, unscrewed the plastic cap, and took a drink. The water was ice cold. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. 2 weeks later, the sky opened up and dumped a miserable, freezing rain over the city. I pulled my car into the driveway of the mid-century house. My house. The tires hissed over the wet asphalt, parked haphazardly on the front lawn. Crushing a bed of expensive hydrangeas was a budget-moving truck. The bright yellow logo on the side was smeared with mud and road grime. I killed the engine. The rhythmic beating of the windshield wipers stopped, leaving only the dull, heavy drumming of the rain against the roof of my car. I sat there for a moment, inhaling the smell of damp car upholstery and cold coffee, watching the front door. David was moving out. His salary was capped. His assets were locked. Without the ability to leverage his company shares for massive bank loans, he couldn't afford to buy another house in this zip code, let alone maintain the lifestyle he was used to. He was renting a 2-bedroom apartment near the airport. The heavy oak front door opened. David walked out, carrying a large, poorly taped cardboard box. He wasn't wearing a suit today. He wore gray sweatpants and a faded college hoodie that was fraying at the cuffs. Without the expensive haircuts and the tailored clothes, he looked a decade older. The dark circles under his eyes looked bruised, permanent. Behind him, struggling with a black trash bag full of clothes, came Brenda. I almost didn't recognize her. The hot pink velour and heavy gold jewelry were gone. The expensive salon extensions had been removed, leaving her natural hair thin, brittle, and heavily damaged from the chemical burns of her fight with Jessica. She wore a beige raincoat that swallowed her small frame. She looked exhausted, entirely deflated, complaining bitterly with every step she took toward the truck. I grabbed my umbrella from the passenger seat, pushed the car door open, and stepped out into the rain. The cold water hit my ankles instantly, soaking through my socks. I pressed the button on the umbrella, and the black canopy shot open with a sharp, echoing thwump. David stopped halfway down the driveway when he saw me. The cardboard box in his hands sagged in the middle. The tape was peeling back, exposing the edges of a video game console. "You're early," he muttered. His voice was entirely flat. He didn't have the energy for anger anymore. He was just surviving the wreckage. "I wanted to do a final walkthrough before you handed over the keys," I said, walking closer. The rain drummed loudly against my umbrella. The air smelled of wet concrete and dying flowers. "We didn't trash the place, Clara," he said bitterly, adjusting his grip on the box. "You won. You got everything. You don't have to gloat." "I'm not gloating. I'm verifying." I looked past him at Brenda. She stopped, dropping the trash bag onto the wet driveway. She glared at me, her mouth twisting into a sour, ugly line, but she didn't say a word. The fight had been completely beaten out of her. Without David's bottomless bank account to fund her lifestyle, she was entirely dependent on him again, moving into his cramped apartment. The sugar baby fantasy was dead. "Where is Jessica?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. "I thought she'd be here to help you pack." David flinched. The reaction was microscopic, but I caught it. A muscle in his jaw twitched violently. "She's gone," he said, staring at the wet asphalt. When the bank accounts froze and she realized I didn't own the company anymore, she keyed my car and blocked my number. She moved to Miami with some guy she met on a yacht. I felt a dark, heavy knot in my chest loosen slightly. It was so perfectly, predictably cheap. Jessica didn't love him. She loved the reflection of herself she saw in his money. The moment the mirror shattered, she walked away. And David, who had thrown away a decade of loyalty for a shiny object, was left holding nothing but the broken glass. "I see," I said softly. David looked up at me. The rain was blowing sideways under the hood of his sweatshirt, matting his hair to his forehead. For a single, fleeting second, I saw a flash of genuine, devastating regret in his eyes. He looked at me, not as the woman who had ruined him, but as the woman he had completely taken for granted, the woman who used to have dinner, waiting, the woman who used to quietly rub his shoulders when he was stressed. "Clara," he started, his voice cracking slightly. He took a half step toward me, the cardboard box in his hands crinkled. If I had just... "Don't," I interrupted, my voice slicing through the heavy, wet air like a razor. I didn't yell. I just shut the door. "Don't ruin the ending by apologizing, David. It doesn't suit you, and I don't want to hear it." I held out my hand, palm up. The rain hit my bare skin, cold and sharp. He stared at my hand for a long time. Then, heavily, he shifted the box to one arm, reached into his sweatpants pocket, and pulled out the heavy brass key to the front door. He dropped it into my palm. The metal was warm from his body heat. "Goodbye, David," I said. I didn't wait for him to reply. I turned my back to him, walking past Brenda and her garbage bags, and climbed the stone steps to the front porch. I slipped the key into the lock. It turned with a heavy, satisfying click. I stepped inside and shut the heavy oak door, cutting off the sound of the rain, the sound of the truck, and the sight of my past entirely. The house was empty. It wasn't just devoid of furniture. It was devoid of the heavy, suffocating anxiety that used to coat the walls like invisible nicotine stains. I stood in the center of the massive, open-concept living room. My wet shoes left dark smudges on the pristine hardwood floors. There was no sofa for Brenda to lounge on. There was no glass coffee table to hold David's expensive bourbon glasses. The abstract art was gone, leaving pale, rectangular ghosts on the freshly painted white walls. I closed my umbrella and leaned it against the front door, listening to the water drip onto the mat. Drip, drip, drip. The silence in the house was absolute. It was so quiet, it almost rang in my ears. For 10 years, my life had been filled with noise. The noise of Brenda's complaints, the noise of David's excuses, the noise of my own internal panic as I tried to keep a failing marriage afloat. Then, the violent, chaotic noise of the police station, the boardroom, the lawyers. Now, there was nothing. I walked into the kitchen. The marble island was still there, cold and unforgiving. I ran my fingers over the edge. In my previous life, I had died right here. I had collapsed on this floor, my heart giving out under the weight of betrayal and profound, unmedicated stress. I remembered the smell of the bleach. I remembered the freezing linoleum of the cheap apartment I had been banished to. I looked down at my feet. I was wearing sturdy leather flats. My heart was beating steadily against my ribs, a strong, rhythmic thumping that felt incredibly grounding. I walked over to the massive windows overlooking the backyard. The rain was still falling, washing the mud off the patio stones. The sky was a bruising shade of purple and gray. Winning didn't feel like a movie. There were no swelling strings in the background. There was no sudden, magical realization that everything was perfect now. I was 32 years old. I was entirely alone in a massive house, holding the reins of a tech company I barely cared about, with a divorce decree sitting on my kitchen counter. I was tired. My bones ached, but I was breathing. I walked over to the refrigerator. It was the only appliance David hadn't managed to drag out. I pulled the heavy stainless steel door open. The bright, sterile light illuminated the empty shelves. Sitting on the middle rack was a single, cheap bottle of red wine I had bought at a gas station on the way over, and a plastic cup. I grabbed the bottle. I didn't have a corkscrew, so I had bought the twist-off kind. The metal cap clicked loudly as I broke the seal. I poured a heavy measure into the plastic cup. It smelled intensely of synthetic grapes and cheap alcohol. I took a sip. It was terrible. It tasted like vinegar and regret. I smiled. The smile grew, stretching across my face until my cheeks actually ached. A laugh bubbled up in my chest, short and ragged at first, then louder. It echoed off the empty walls, bright and sharp. I took another sip of the terrible wine. I looked around the empty, cavernous room. I didn't need to rebuild a marriage. I didn't need to earn anyone's love. I had ripped the rotting wood out of my foundation and burned it to the ground. The plot of land was finally clear. I could build whatever I wanted now. I walked back to the center of the living room, sat directly on the cold hardwood floor, and pulled my knees to my chest. I listened to the rain. I listened to my own breathing. I felt the rough texture of my wool sweater against my chin. This was it, the second chance. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't romantic. It was surgical, ruthless, and entirely mine. I took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs completely, and closed my eyes. The nightmare was over. I was finally awake. There is no magical fairy tale when you claw your way back from the grave. Just the brutal, satisfying work of taking out the trash. David lost his company, Brenda lost her sugar baby lifestyle, and Jessica vanished the second the money dried up. I walked away with the house, the equity, and my life. What would you have done? Would you have taken the company or just burned it all down? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of absolute, ruthless karma, please hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe for more.